Greetings, everyone. Welcome to today's reading to Denver Debuts in Conversation with the Word, a storytelling sanctuary. My name is Susie Q. Smith, and I am here to introduce the event today. I am one of the event organizers for the Margins Conference, which will be happening on the internet August 1st and 2nd later this year. So the Margins Conference is a 2-day virtual conference where writers from the margins join together to support the growth and development of healthy careers and writing communities that welcome and embrace voices from all races, colors, genders, sexual orientations, lifestyles, classes, national origins, religions, ethnicities, ages, and abilities. At the heart of Margins is learning, building community, and celebrating. So we will learn from agents, publishers, authors, educators, and publishing industry experts. We'll connect with our community through small group discussions, breakout group Q&As with our speakers, and one-on-one feedback sessions. We'll also celebrate with a public book fair via virtual portal, and we're still working on the possibility of a Saturday evening dance party because many of us are better dancers when we are alone. So thank you very much for being here. We're going to continue to bring weekly programming to do all of the same things that that Margins Conference is trying to do, right? Which is bringing people together, celebrating voices, celebrating diversity in literature, and hearing beautiful work. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm really, really excited to introduce our moderator, who will introduce today's guests, who are both poets who I'm very excited to listen to. I like them both very much and really love their work. So I'm going to introduce our moderator today. So I'm excited to introduce Katarina Jang. Katarina is a first-generation Filipina Taiwanese American poet and creative entrepreneur. She is the co-founder of slant'd, a creative collection of Asian Americans on the journey of self-discovery. They publish an annual literary magazine and host community gatherings, now all virtual and open to all. She's also the co-founder of Spectacle, an inclusive content marketing agency based here in Denver, Colorado, which is where I'm streaming from you as well today. I think we are all in Denver today, and we are coming from our homes to yours. So without further ado, please welcome Katarina.
Thank you for the intro, Susie, and hello, everyone. Yes, I think we're all in Denver, Colorado, and I'm so excited that we have an Asian American focused poetry event. I feel like one of the amazing things that has come out of this pandemic is that people can see what we're doing no matter where they are. And it's been so wonderful to see cultural events that are tailored to communities that don't always get the stage. So I'm super excited to announce our two guests today. We have Deborah Jang and Diana Khoi Nguyen. First, a little bit about Deborah. Deborah Jang earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Colorado, Denver, and continues to learn new techniques, explore new materials, and deepen her vision. Her art and design pursuits span 30 years. She has participated in numerous group and solo shows, public installations, and art festivals throughout the Western U.S., including Loveland Sculpture in the Park, Denver International Airport, La Quinta Arts Festival, Art Student League of Denver, Evergreen Sculpture Walk, Foothills Art Center, and Beverly Hills Art in the Gardens. Currently, her work is shown at A Gallery in Salt Lake City, Utah, Modern Eden in San Francisco, California, Osmosis Gallery in Newark, Colorado, and in downtown Englewood, Colorado, and also can be found in corporate and private collections across the US and beyond. Amazing, so many great places to see your work. That is awesome. And then we also have Diana here with us. And Diana is a poet and multimedia artist. She is the author of Ghost of, published by Omnidom in 2018, which was selected by Terrence Hayes. In addition to winning the 92Y Discovery/Boston Review Poetry Contest, 2019 Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and Colorado Book Award, she was also a finalist for the National Book Award and LA Times Book Prize. A Kundiman Fellow, she is currently teaching in the Randolph College Low Residency MFA and will be an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh starting in the fall. Wow, so many amazing credentials. I'm super excited to have you both and host you both. We're gonna let Diana and Deborah run the show, and then we will also leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments as this event unfolds, feel free to pop them into the comment section, and we will get to those at the end. So without further ado, Deborah and Diana, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Katarina. I thought we would start, if both of us, and perhaps Deborah could start first, to briefly kind of describe the book, in case readers out there aren't yet familiar with both of these books, before we kind of launch into our discussion and sharing of poems and some other media. So Deborah, I'll let you kind of kick off here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Diana and Katarina. The title of my book is Float True. It was released in March, just as things were kind of shutting down globally. I think of this collection as kind of a cumulative swirl of things that matter most to me. There is family history around immigration stories. There are issues of justice and poetry of witness. There's emotion, reflection, ocean, ecstatic engagement with nature. So it's kind of I think of it almost like a heart-mind dump. And it's a heart-mind dump that, like water, finds its own kind of intrinsic flow and rhythm. That's it.
Thank you, Deborah. While you were talking, I showed everybody your book cover.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yes, I wanted to mention that the cover image is by artist Grant Williams from Denver.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I'll try to be brief here. Ghost Dove really engages with primarily surrounding around the suicide of my brother in 2014, and examining that kind of catalyst event in terms of what happens afterwards with regards to documentation of grief, but also kind of looking back, thinking about the trauma that's carried between generations, from my parents to myself and my siblings and onward. So thinking about the Vietnamese diaspora as it kind of pertains to a very specific family here, my family that is. So one thing I noticed, Deborah, is both of these books they both deal with a lot of different things. And so we're going to try to distill to a few different topics here. But the first one that comes to mind specifically is immigration. So there's very much referencing of family immigration stories here, of various different, from different countries, coming together to the United States, but during different eras as well. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about immigration as it occurs within your own family and within the book. And I'm happy to share a little bit about mine as well. And we can perhaps read some poems which touch upon this.
Oh, sure. Well, I would say we represent different eras of the Asian immigration to this country. I am here as a result of the early wave of East Asian immigrants that started in the mid-1800s, and that's when the Chinese were fleeing political unrest and economic hardship in their homeland, and there seemed to be opportunities here to seek out mining and railroad work in Gold Mountain, as they referred to this continent, this country. I have sketchy information, mostly passed down through oral stories. And I've also seen a few immigration documents and letters that kind of fill in the story a bit. My mother's father was here as early as 1892, I believe. And I'm told he worked the silver mines in Nevada. He had a wife and son, both of whom died here. And just to set a little bit of context, after the Transcontinental Railroad was complete in 1869. The cheap Chinese labor was no longer of value or useful, which then fed resentments and abuse under such fear-mongering rhetoric known as yellow peril. And there were exclusion laws passed against Chinese specifically. And because of those laws, there was kind of a dearth of available Chinese women. And so my grandfather returned to China and was matched up with my grandmother, who was from another village, who was quite a bit younger. And on the return voyage in 1924, aboard the USS Taft, they were detained on Angel Island, just off San Francisco, where interrogations and indignities were conducted in an effort to disqualify people from entering and to further hinder or slow down the Chinese influx. So Tell Me is a poem that I wrote, and I did a little research from the transcripts from my grandparents' Angel Island experience, which includes the actual questions they were asked. And as the poem progresses, those questions morph into current day questions that immigrants and refugees face as they try to enter this country. So this is called Tell Me. After last night's storm subsided, releasing musk from wetted wood and tremors from beyond, in which room now, where windows rattle, from which far corner's highest rafter does the nightingale sing? Where does the water come from for domestic use in your husband's village? How were you conveyed to your husband's village for your wedding? Was there any music accompanying you? Was there a feast held before your wedding? How high was your husband's house? In which direction did the front door of your husband's house face? Past village gate, the way grows thick with enigmatic confrontations. Tongue-twisting pronunciations distort the mouth, wince the eye, test the matrix of survival. If you cast your gaze out further, does hope brighten or grow dimmer? Where does the nightingale land? What is your final destination in the United States? Can you recite the 10 Commandments? What color is the Bible? Where did you last go on vacation with your husband? Why did you want to leave your home country? Do you fear going back to your home country? If yes, why? Where is it written one path suffices? In whose truth does love abide? From which well, how far deep? In whose name do we keep hope breathing its own light? How old were you when you started working? How old were you when your mother came to the US? Have you ever been tortured in your home country? When? Where? Do you believe you will be tortured if returned to your home country? Could you move to a different part of your country and be safe? Step into the dusty footprint. Send armadas out to sea. Feed a weary caravan. Keep the children free and strong. The blessed light grows dim. Open hearts, doors will follow. Souls on ice join hands to shore. Questions beg of lifelines seeking. Where do I end and you begin? So once they got off the Angel Island, then my grandparents settled in Richmond, California, and then they ran a Chinese restaurant. My mom was born in the US as a US citizen. The family worked hard to make a life and to overcome this yellow peril stigma and to be accepted by the dominant culture. She worked hard at it and succeeded on many levels. She even rejected her parents' tradition of sending her to Chinese school when she was young. And ultimately, she refused to go back to China with them when they returned. So she and my dad represented the assimilation that many immigrants of their generation strove for purposes of acceptance and sometimes survival. And this behavior contributed to the myth of the model minority, a stereotype that's touted by certain whites that drives a wedge between Chinese and other non-white communities. It's a stereotype that fails when you observe the breadth of the Asian and Asian American experience in the US. And it's a stereotype that crumbles under the intensity of our present COVID moment, which is exposing hidden biases just below the surface and vicious knee-jerks.
Thank you, Deborah. It's wonderful to hear you read that poem aloud, and also to bring up a lot of different topics that have been in my mind recently. I read Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and I've been attending some virtual kind of forums just surrounding racism right now. I feel like there's a resurgence, or at least unearthing in a new way in the era of the COVID pandemic, with anti-Asian sentiment that's kind of happening. But I want to kind of step back just a couple steps here and just share a little bit also about my parents. They also fled, but really right around the fall of Saigon in 1975. So both of my parents came here separately. Both of my grandfathers worked at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and I think they knew each other briefly, but my parents actually met in California years later in their 20s. And growing up, my parents never talked about these journeys. And I remember, I think it's in 5th grade when in California, at least, school curriculum where you're supposed to, think about Ellis Island and where do our ancestors come from? And I was supposed to interview my parents, and then hearing the questions in your poem, Deborah, of course, which come from the questionnaire, but I asked my parents these questions and they just wouldn't answer me. So they were just like, just say we came here, on a ship. And my mother was like, I left Vietnam on a boat. And then that was like, that's it. And it wasn't until many years later, after reading other former Vietnamese refugees, hearing about their stories, and then bringing that to the table to my mother and also to my father to ask them, was it like this or was it like this? So the poem I'm going to read, which is called The Exodus, kind of utilizes thinking about aspects of other people's stories, because that's how I gained information first and foremost before actually hearing it from my parents. And so by understanding other former Vietnamese refugees coming out of Saigon after the war, I began to actually get my parents to kind of open up a little bit about their journeys. So I'm reading here The Exodus. The Exodus, Saigon to Los Angeles, 1975 to 2015. For a long time, it didn't seem possible. Then the whispering grew louder, the blur and hum of synchronous movements, as in a murmuration, leaderless, with the shades drawn. A poet, burning his life's work, a mother measuring out small bottles of poison. As my grandfather and his sons were ushered through the droves, remorse rose up in him, tear gas going over and over and over. Then everyone became equals, each one disappearing in the shadow of another. Touch, as a bird rarely seen unless believed in, wretched. A youth points a toy gun at her chin, stupid, girlish pleasure rising for a moment. Still, every living body finds a routine no matter its damage. 2 minutes after I was born, I had already made my first evacuation. Years later, when I found myself in Saigon, I bought a lighter at the war market. Etched on one side was a nude woman, reclined, with her legs spread, an owl at her sex, one wing in, the other wing out, two owls standing by. Why should we mourn? Isn't this the history we want, one in which we survive? After many days at sea, my mother's guide boat found rescue. A young man collapsed and died beside her, the journey's end too much to bear. Before my brother was born, all four of us slept beside one another in one bed. In an effort to resist memory, my mother asked me to take her away. The night before, the monks came to usher my brother out of the realm of the living. We gathered on the same bed, sifting through photos and stories of him. At the funeral, his hand was warm, so my mother would not let go. Maybe you forget why you were here, that you didn't belong, but just because it was life didn't mean it could be life, that you could come back to life, but not return to living. And if you bypassed a war wouldn't bypass you. I'm curious, Deborah, so you talk about your grandfather coming to the States and then his first wife and child perishing here. And I can't even imagine what it was like to come to the Gold Mountain in that time. And I'm curious, were you ever able to speak with your grandfather? You mentioned a little bit about some information being passed down, but I didn't know if it passed down through your mother or what your mother knew from her father and so forth. So I'm also kind of curious in terms of what forms of knowledge get passed down. And I know too that you were able to look at some documents to think about like silences that occur between generations and in terms of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of, no, I never met any of my grandparents, and they had all deceased before I was born. So the knowledge that I have is, I would say, some of it is just maybe offhand comments that my parents would make about their parents that I would just tuck away. Or there would be photos around. I remember this oval-shaped photo of my grandmother and grandfather on our mantle in a little brass frame, and I actually, in a presentation further on in this show, I will be able to share those with people. And so a lot of it's just staring at those kinds of things, or thinking about them, and applying some imagination, maybe piecing things together. So working with very little real tangible information. Did you have much visual material to draw from?
Not at all. My parents unusually did not live close to their parents in the United States, in California. All my other aunts and uncles live within, I think, 10 to 15 drive or thereabouts, given LA traffic in Southern California. So I didn't see my relatives that often outside of just some holidays. And my parents, of course, as I mentioned, were really quite reticent. But it's kind of funny. So I ultimately went into scholarship into other kind of Vietnamese refugee stories to try to understand my own parents, because there was such silence around it. And it wasn't until when my grandfather passed away shortly before my brother died that when my grandmother was moved into one of her daughter's homes, one of my aunts, all these photos kind of emerged. And it's also kind of funny, I'm just remembering now, my grandfather talked a lot and my grandmother never spoke when my grandfather was alive. Like, she never kind of told stories. But now everybody likes to remark on how she doesn't stop talking and she's just nonstop telling stories.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
It is, but I think everybody is so, like, she really like doesn't ever stop talking, and so like you could be trapped for hours if you're on the couch. So people have gotten to just like nod and they kind of move away, but it's still quite novel for me when I see her. And she's actually in San Jose now. I visited her and I actually was able to record some of her stories because I think she's in her 90s, and we, you never know when those stories might disappear. So I've been thinking a lot about. It's funny to me how I come into my own voids of knowledge about family history after I've tried to write about it, right? Piecing what I do know. And for me, I have found that the silence around, and also like the ghost of the war, is very much a kind of shadow which leads up to and informs my brother's own mental health and suicide. And I mention that in the sense that I haven't yet talked about how my parents were quite abusive to us as children. I left home the day I turned 18 and didn't turn back for a long time. And my brother's death at the age of 24, when he was 24, I think I'd just turned 30, finally kind of brought me back to reconcile with my parents. So a way of trying to understand the refugee crisis after the end of the Vietnam War was also a way for me to understand, like, did my parents endure horrific things? Is that why they did horrific things to us, right? And thinking about my own flight from my parents' home and my brother's flight. I mean, both my siblings lived in that house. My sister still lives there. She's in her 30s. And my brother was able to escape from death. So I'm curious if you'd be willing, Deborah, to talk a little bit more about ghosts and voids of knowledge and moving into absence. In particular, I've been thinking a lot about your poems, Hearsay and Tell Me, but I wasn't sure which one you were going to read.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear you read.
Okay, yeah, I could read, let's see, I just read Tell Me. So I could read Hearsay, and this again is really, I call it hearsay because it's what I've heard, but a lot of it is, it comes from my imagination. I never met my grandmother. I just tucked away bits of information that would come at me. But I think maybe about more than 3 years ago, when I became a grandmother myself, for some reason, I became very interested in what her life was like, what might have been her experience traveling across the ocean with this old man kind of thing. I just can't imagine. So I think of her as ghosted in that, well, first of all, by my grandfather because of the patriarchy of the Chinese culture, and then by U.S. culture once she was here, just because of the racial and gender bias. And then there's just the matter of being ghosted by time. But I think that what I did is you just take these hunches and clues and fragments and seek to assemble an image of something, maybe an understanding, an essential understanding, perhaps, just something to hold on to. It's kind of a cumulative process, this reconstruction, and it's similar to the way I make art, where I take bits and scraps and pieces lying around and try to put them together join them together with one another to create whole new entities, and this approach I kind of, when I think of it metaphorically with my art, I think of it as more of an additive approach, whereas in traditional sculpture, perhaps the artist imagine imagines a form within a larger block of wood or metal and takes off chunks of it to reveal the underlying form within. I think that subtractive approach is maybe more how I see your poems with the actual cutouts from the blocks of text and the way your brother cut himself out of the photos. But anyway, back to the to my grandmother. I think I'll read this poem, Hearsay, and it just comes again from the imagination and what I imagine she might want to say to me. Not sure. It's called Hearsay. They say you sang like an angel on that island in the bay, where foghorns drowned out nighttime murmurs, children's names recited, prayers to deaf, dumb gods, poems chiseled into barrack walls, lives left out in the rain. I heard them say I have your giggle and your preference for peaches. I never touched your flesh or face, but this is what I gather. From Fa Wen to Gold Mountain, from girl to wife now claimed, tides ferried you from village days, from village hearth to far foggy days. The islands where the angels weep nabbed you just offshore, offered a thin blanket, cold rice, interrogations, and a dreary 3-month chill. Finally, you and Gong Chao found a spot to land on. You served up rice to sailors and homesick fellows hungry for your song. My mother June, your feisty first. Roslyn and David followed. Restaurant shiny, children strong. Then came the day to return. History called you home to China. June refused to go along and kept Roslyn too. The clouds and tides that brought you here ushered you back through. Within 2 years, word arrived. Gong Chao died in China like he wanted. 2 months prior, on a whisper, you two had slipped away. Especially on misty days, I listen for your song. I know your fathoms of despair, your gentle grasp on pleasure. The peace of spirit that you seek encompasses all in-betweens, measures life and graces. Though ocean tides rip heart from heart, the interwash of time and tide returns us deep to deep. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
And I would love to
thinking
hear about your silences, your ghosts, your just that whole story that centers around the absence of your brother now.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where to enter here. I think I'll start hearing the really vivid imagining of your grandmother's journey, right? And to enter into the realm of the little that you do know, but to populate it with such concrete environments. And right, it feels very cinematic in that poem. Quite similarly, there's what I have been able to see visually for myself and for my parents are the photographs of all the people clambering to try to get into the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and helicopters, right, evacuating from the rooftop. And I know that my father's family and my paternal grandfather left on that day because of the connection to the embassy, but I don't know what it was exactly like for him. So when I see these photographs, I try to imagine, like, is that hand there? Would that hand have been my uncle's, right? So I'll read it. And then, so there's that where I have photographic knowledge, but isn't precise in terms of how it overlaps with my own family. And then I want to talk a little bit about how ghosts appear in dreams and dream logic and dream hearsay. My mother has dreams, of course, about her children, the ones that are living, myself and my sister, and also my brother who's not here. But I've had disturbing dreams too. So I'm going to read a poem that kind of weaves a little bit of all these things. Yeah, okay. This is I Keep Getting Things Wrong, and it's after Mark Levine. 1. My father, just out of his teens, stands on the rooftop of the embassy in Saigon, his birthplace. He gives his hand to his mother, and all around them, 1,000 hands reach up, not to wave. None of his siblings died. Their bodies like a fine chain balled tight in a fist. They made it out alive. Why is he looking at me like this? 2. This is the idea of a house my father built in Southern California. These 2 circle windows and bamboo on all sides. He brought a jungle here, complete with French doors. These are the tiles from his mother's house, cool against my cheek. I talk to him in one tongue. He answers from the morgue. 3. Let's get on with it. When I return to that house, I eat the food left out for my dead brother. I don't waste much. I slide open and close his closet, untangle the window blinds. The bees are quiet in the walls now, the colonies dying off. His shoes on my father's feet are the only moving thing in sight. 4. On their flight to America, the choice for lunch was rice or pasta, but when the meal cart reached them, there was only pasta. My father smiled at the flight attendant and asked, "Why didn't you reap enough rice?" 6. The certificates we use to be certain of each other. ID cards, contracts, permits, deeds, fishing licenses, driving licenses, car titles, carry permits, registrations, income statements, IOUs, testimonials, certificates of birth, custody, and death, letters of consent. Do I have permission to approach our drowning man from behind? 6. I dreamed last night, my mother says, that you were in danger and your brother was young still, but you were the same as you are now. He was looking for me, and I was looking for you. 7. I sit at my desk, typing and deleting words. Twice I dreamed I fucked my brother. I keep trying to wake up. I keep getting things wrong. I'm ready to feel better.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, thank you also for reading Hearsay and Tell Me. I feel like there's a lot of threads that connect, but of course, different families, different places, and also the kind of joint location of California where our relatives kind of converge. And I'm always curious, like, did they ever encounter each other in passing in various kind of ways?
Yeah.
I do imagine the ghosts kind of mingling together and watching us.
Watching us enter the middle of the country somehow. Right up here.
In a mountainous, cold territory. Yeah, my relatives do not understand snow and this kind of winter. I'm just trying to be mindful here of time. I definitely wanted to, you kind of brought up, and I'm also seeing the backdrop behind you with the paintbrushes, but this wonderful process of like additive accumulation in your composition of writing, but also in your fine arts, visual arts practice. And I'm curious to hear, or I guess I'm curious to see, I know you have some pieces that may echo some of the pieces within your book, if you'd be willing to share them, if you'd be willing to talk more about this kind of collaboration in terms of the visual art as it intersects with with Float True. And I know I've been working in a video medium, and I think you have some videos as well.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I think that's an interesting common thing between us, that there is that visual art aspect. And from what I understand, your poetry actually led you into the visual explorations, or were you already engaged in that?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I was not actively engaging. I think I felt quite shy as somebody who didn't have any training in visual arts. All my training has primarily been in poetry, first and foremost. But what really kind of led me into that, kind of two things. So the book is really centered around these photographs where my brother cut himself out of. These photographs hung in the halls of our family house. And he did this 2 years before he died. And then they hung up in the house. My parents called me to say they were alarmed. And I said, why aren't you talking to him? But they couldn't. They were fearful to do so because he was pretty violent in the last 10 years of his life. And I tried to talk to my brother, and that was my the last time he actually spoke to me. And so those photos hung in the house. And then he died, and then like, you know, we weren't talking about them, which is like kind of haunting, right? And then the photos hung after his death because it kind of made sense because he was absent in the physical sense. And I don't speak of this quite lightly. It's just like, I feel like when I report it, I'm reporting the news because it's so painful to talk about. And so there was this like huge silence within my family where we don't talk about these pictures. We don't talk about what Oliver has done. My brother's name is Oliver. And so around the first year anniversary of his death, and this is what kind of led me into a visual arts practice. I feel like it's my brother who's kind of his actions, and then also maybe from the afterlife, he's kind of a catalyst for my engagement with the visual form. But I wanted to reverse the negative power of these images, right? So on that anniversary of his death, similar to your additive process, right? Because I'm not cutting away from the pictures. I wanted to fill in. I wanted to kind of heal these photos. I'm not going to read from it, but I will show, I can show an image kind of really quite briefly. So this is what a photograph will look like. And then I began to kind of fill in the body. And then after filling in the body, I began to think about, well, what about all of those faces of us, you know, what if poetry could also act as like the framework around the white space? So thinking about the void. And so those triptychs kind of lace through the book. But funny enough, actually, I did do a work of video art before I wrote this book, because in my PhD class at the University of Denver, a prompt was offered, not to me specifically, but the prompt was, what would a radical eulogy look like? And for me, it was like, radical. Well, one, you wouldn't praise the dead. So then I was like, well, what is praise? Praise is sometimes imitation of somebody, right? Like, so I was thinking, like, what if I retrace my brother's steps leading to his death? I know he ate McDonald's. We know, I mean, I didn't take the medication that he took to kill himself, but I kind of tried to retrace what it might have looked like for him to plan his suicide. And then I was like, well, radical. What if I also just build my own coffin and then lay in it for a while? Which is like, sounds really terrifying. It was terrifying for me too, but I kind of went through this process. I did it. I ate McDonald's, then I built a coffin, and then I lay in it. And this was in spring of 2017. And inhabiting that kind of coffin space was really the first time that allowed for me to, like, I actually began talking to my brother, and I started crying, and I hadn't cried since, like, I hadn't cried at all actually since his death. So it was this weird thing where this like practice of like radical empathy kind of like brought me into kind of communion with him. I'm not going to show that video, but I can provide a link to it, I guess, if anybody's interested. But yeah, I would love to see your videos as well, Deborah. Would you be willing to share?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you want me to go first?
Yes.
Because you're going to show one, aren't you?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of a weird transition for the one that I was going to show about my mother. So, I mean, I don't really care about order, but
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I thought, well, let me just go with this. We're going to try to share the screen with viewers right now. So be patient, be kind. Here we go. I'll just give a little brief. One thing I've started doing while shut in as I am, I'm just starting to experiment with other media around the book. And so I've put together a couple of mini productions. That's mini collaborate. Well, one is a collaboration, and I'm inviting people to share their video and audio clips that I could work with. Ideally, those offerings would be inspired somehow in response to the book, the poems. So the first video that I want to share is one of those little tiny collaborations from the poem "Everything is Everything," and it features a friend who's a singer, Tamika Coleman, and then it's fairly short, and then the video that will follow that goes back to my mom and that the way I described her earlier on as a very kind of seeker of acceptance, and she just really wanted to fit into society, to this dominant culture that she was that she'd actually been born into in this immigrant family. So these two, they're a little different, but I'll go ahead and just show them in succession.
The sheer fast before us in subtle undulation shrugs, in the hunch where his shoulders rise, where vague mists poses wise. Here the ponder strokes the mind while earth's crust mourns saddle feet. How sky weeps softly broken, where were doves fully woken, sing through long nights, through cold wet springs. Everything is everything. Everything is everything.
eldest daughter of Gong Chao and Zhu Xi, immigrant couple from China, born in Richmond, California, north of San Francisco, just across the bay. Named Fang Wet for the ancestors, stateside she was June, to me forever long. Fireworks the night before announced her arrival, July 5th, 1930. Every Independence Day, she felt pangs of affirmative glee, as if she belonged, at least to the sky. At 9, she was sent to Chinese school in San Francisco, an immigrant custom she soon rejected. She hopped on the Greyhound bus alone, rode home to her parents' Chicago. At Richmond Elementary, she joined the harmonica band, worked the restaurant after school, did not miss a shift. During wartime, the family moved to the Valley, where June was a big hit. Team debater, class treasurer, best dressed girl at Merced High, she had it going on. Chinese pilots training at the airbase lined up for her dance crew. She tangled, cha-cha, bunny hop, with gusto and soft laughter. Got a job downtown Merced, selling ladies' dresses. Took up with the owner, who promised to promote her. Post-war, Gong Chao had made plans to return to China. The story goes, June said no, kept her little sister with her while the ship dipped off horizon. June and Sis stayed with Monroe, the now betrothed store owner. He promised her folks his good care, but didn't really follow through, so June then divorced him. Though not before the three of us, claimed her heart forever. Dave Allen was the next guy. With him she bore 2 more sons of Chinese-Irish extraction. Bridge clubs, soccer, cul-de-sacs filled her American sky, especially on July 4th, her urgent eyes scanned the night for impapa, or maybe something keener. By now we lived back by the bay. It was the flowered 60s. Her 5 young grew out their hair, while she and Dave plied the days with good times, hard work, harder drink. He died young, she carried on. The children ventured forth. Her last man was Ken Wilkins, though there were others in between. All this to say, she enjoyed the company of fellows. When Ken passed, it hit her hard. The children couldn't see her. At 62, June was through. We sprinkled her at sea. I strike the gong, rumbles water, ripples up, let's go. That was a lot of that. Some of the content of that, Diana, was inspired by the photos that I saw in your book and how you use that, mine that material.
Thank you for sharing those videos, Deborah. I'm noticing the time for us, so I'm just going to share links. I'll have the links to the video that I mentioned because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. And I think Katarina is moderating the Q&A. I don't mind. I mean, I want to make sure that we can hear from others.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I am so inspired by the way that you both are piecing together your family history in such a beautiful, artistic way that helps you both come to terms with where you are in your life. And I feel like so much of Asian American history is erased by our government, like completely omitted from textbooks, even covered up. And so I know for me, I feel this urgent need to learn more about our family histories and just general history as Asian Americans. And so both of your work is very, very inspiring. I'm looking at our comments, and There are lots of virtual snaps from Lily and Rudy saying that your poetry is so beautiful. Everyone, feel free to drop in your questions. We have a couple of minutes to answer them, but I have a question for both of you that I'm curious about, and it's kind of two-part. We're obviously in a very unique time of the world, and we're all in quarantine, and so I was curious as to what your creative process has been like in quarantine, and what are some topics or themes that are top of mind for you in your work during this pandemic?
I think experimentation, because everything's upside down anyway. I'm sort of being a little bit bolder than I usually am, and just trying out like the video, learning that kind of stuff. But also the idea of collaborating with other artists. I think in this isolation, there's you kind of don't take that for granted anymore. And so being creative in ways to work with others and to celebrate their work as well.
I want to echo that as well. I feel privileged to have a little more time. And so that means also kind of playing around with new things. Like I just got an instant camera, and I'm going to try to take a photo a day, which is scary and not going to share it with anybody. But so just trying out new things, but also thinking about collaboration too, just in terms of form. So, I'm finishing up teaching a class, an MFA class at UW Bothell in Washington State. And yesterday, just for fun, I entered the class with a virtual classroom from my phone in addition to my computer, and I named that person Diana 2.0, and then I invited everybody else to enter as their duplicates. And then we played around with the different devices, like how we could have multiple ways of seeing each other in that space. And then we became a much bigger community. It was just silly, but I think everybody had a lot of fun. So just also playing as a form of collaboration too, which I think is really important. But in terms of content, I've also been thinking a lot about the fear and anxieties that I feel about just going outside and being worried about anti-Asian sentiments. And that, of course, is coming into various forms of making. I'm not quite sure how it's manifesting, but I think about that a lot. And I've been reading poems that people have been writing about living while Asian in the time of the pandemic. Thank you for that question, Katarina.
Of course, thank you for sharing. We have one more question from Susie. She asks, as poets who use multiple media, how do you decide which tools will best serve a story?
It starts with the words, the language, and the process. I think if they're referring to the different media, I think that comes in maybe secondarily for me, and at least at this point in my creative process. But I'm maybe after this period of experimentation, maybe that will be different for me.
I don't think of myself primarily as a poet anymore, but just a person who kind of noodles around at stuff, which kind of gives me a little bit more permission to play. So I think of poetics as a way of being attuned to the world, right? Of paying attention, of listening, which is to say, I don't always know what medium will emerge. Sometimes I'll take a picture, sometimes I'll play with paper, sometimes I'll capture something on video. It's just whatever is there. And then oftentimes I find myself if something happens in a poem, I'll also kind of revisit similar ideas or themes or formal constraints in video or in collage, if that kind of makes sense. So it kind of arises simultaneously in multiple ways. And so it's like a chicken or egg. I mean, I don't know. They just all kind of, it's like fungi. They just all kind of came up once after the rain. Yeah, and I've learned to kind of embrace that and not to feel weird, and it just makes me happy to engage in that way. Yeah, thank you for that question, Susie.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that is exactly the way creativity works, is to just be this open channel and let whatever it is that comes out of you that wants to come out. We have one last question before we wrap. I know we're at time, but Rudy asks, does the process of writing burden you or free you?
Eventually it frees, and then the work can feel burdensome sometimes, yes, but it's work that's kind of worth it. I'm starting to think of my poems as little language temples that I prepare to enter, and often that preparation is in silence, and then moving into that space and whatever you can conjure to create the beauty or the mystery or the urgency. It is freeing ultimately. So.
I think of burden only in the sense that I can't not write, and that sucks because it's hard to write. I don't mean to complain, but it's like, if I could do something else, I probably would. But I can't not do this thing that I do, which involves a lot of emotional stuff that is clear to me and sometimes not clear to me. And it unearths a lot of stuff that we don't normally talk about, day to day or at dinner with friends. But I don't see it as a burden. But it is something that you work through, and it does take a lot of various forms of energy and resources. And I feel lucky to be able to do so. I don't know, in terms of like liberation, I don't think I ever feel freed, because I think I'm always free, but also never free because I live in the United States, and there are so many various institutional powers at work, right? Visible and invisible. But there is a sense of elation that I feel when I've done a lot of hard work in the making, if that makes sense. And that can feel like being free. Because I feel like, oh, I'm flying, and then like, oh, now what am I doing next? So it's kind of this cycle that I wouldn't do anything else. Yeah, thank you for that question, Rudy.
Amazing. Thank you both for sharing about your work, your creative process. I know I'm so inspired to go and learn more about my history. And Diana, the way you make your writing seems very therapeutic, like learning a lot about what's going on internally and surfacing that to the world. So thank you everyone for joining. I think that's all the time we have for today. Both the links for Deborah and Diana's books are in the comments, and also the link for learning more about margins is on this screen right here. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to us. We are always around, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
And thank you, Susie, for also
Thank you, Susie.
and the word. Bye, guys. Be safe.
Bye.